All right, and the last two concepts I'd like to discuss with two-dimensional design principles are proportion and scale. This will be a relatively shorter video as it's much easier, much more straightforward to see these concepts in action. But when we're talking about proportion and scale, we're talking about size, the relationship to size. So scale describes the dimensions of an art object in relationship to the original object or another object in the real world. And we often use the proportions of the human body to determine that size or scale. So when we think about a mural as large scale and a small, tiny sculpture like we see here on the right, Tim Hawkinson's bird, we consider that small. Interesting to note that the sculpture on the right, Tim Hawkinson's bird, is actually made up of his own fingernail clippings. So that's a pretty tiny sculpture that we have here. But again, tiny in relationship to what we consider to be standard, as in the human body. Klaus Oldenburg sculptures here, these are quite large, but again, we're talking about scale in reference to the size of the original object or another object in the world. So here we can see again, the scale relationship between the human body and the art piece. And whether we're trying to capture these things in a photograph or as real-world objects, it's important to note that scale is not just something that's relative to three-dimensional objects, right? Two-dimensional artists have to deal with scale all the time. So these two are connected, scale and proportion. We often determine the scale of something by measuring how large or small it is in proportion to our own human bodies. I'm sure many of you have seen this image before. This is the Great Wave off Kanagawa. And if we look closely in the boats, we can see tiny human figures, which give us an idea of the relationship between them and the Great Wave. We see Mount Fuji in the background, which is formally much smaller than the wave, but we know this is due to distance or atmospheric perspective. But the wave is given its power and its presence by the scale of how much larger it is than the human body. And when talking about the human body, we couldn't talk about proportion without bringing up the Vitruvian Man. So this is a drawing done by Leonardo da Vinci, done off of the notes of the famous architect Vitruvius Pollio. And in it we see the human male fitting inside of the square and the circle. Now this is important because the Greeks felt that the square was a representation of the temporal world, the world of man, and the world that we can physically experience. And the circle was a representation of the heavens, or of that which is eternal and the world that is perfect. So we have the square and the circle, and then the human proportions fitting inside of that, meaning to be a perfect representation of harmonious proportion. Here we see Michelangelo's David based off of these ideal proportions. Ancient Greek mathematical systems felt that the proportions within the body were representations of divine perfection. Now, artists can intentionally distort or warp proportions, as we can see here. We see some paintings by Modigliani where he intentionally elongates the form for aesthetic effect. Other artists do similar things. Here we have Giacometti with his sculptures, again, elongating the human form. Having an understanding of proportion and knowing how to manipulate proportion within the relative scale of the human body. So having a good understanding of proportion, particularly when working with the human figure, is important, as it can better allow you to control the aesthetic that you're trying to go for. So with these elongated forms, there's a certain mood or aesthetic or concept that comes through. We can see this in Picasso's work as well, who intentionally distorted the proportions and faces and bodies of his subjects, and we can see that this creates an aesthetic effect. So just to recap, so thinking about scale and proportion. So scale is the term that we use to describe the dimensions of an art object or image in relationship to the original object or another. The human body is a typical comparison of measurement for scale. And with proportion, this is the term used to describe the relationship between parts of the object and the whole, most often associated with the human body.